Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to another free virtual Thursday program with the Foss Waterway Seaport. I'm your guide tonight, Chris, with Pretty Gritty Tours. And of course, we're all here because of the generous and continued support and sponsorship of Columbia Bank. And I know I'm almost always excited about what we're doing. This is one of those rare treasure ones, which I think is something that not a lot of people talk about or know about, but it's one of the city treasures of the Tacoma area and is something that has elevated us from just some Joe Schmo town to a place on a national pedestal in a lot of ways. And I guess you could even make the argument globally for a few periods there. But the Willits canoes and the Willits brothers of those canoes are really something of an incredible story. And tonight we get to explore that. You get to hear from a couple members of the Willits family. We get to look inside the Willits factory, and you get to see several of these canoes, of which there were almost 1,000. I think it was 950 something official canoes were ever made by hand by the Willits brothers in the course of their life. So that's your taste right there. It's good to see you guys. Please feel free to comment, and I will do my best to answer your questions and shout you guys out as we go along. So let's embark, shall we? Let's shove off and take a look at the Willits canoes. Now here's a snapshot of the Willits Brothers Canoes factory when it was first built. And you can tell by that rad classic car out front kind of time period we're dealing with here. But I love their slogan. You take no risk in ordering from us, which is a bold claim from these two boys. But I have to say, if you look at their history of hand making canoes, they're absolutely right. And this was their thing. They were like, we make canoes. You will like it. If for whatever reason you don't like it, send it back. We'll give you back your money. And I don't think I've ever seen any record of someone being like, I didn't really like this. There were two brothers that made these exquisite canoes, sometimes with the sail kits there, though those were optional. It was Earl and Floyd, and they actually got their start as young men in Des Moines, Iowa, where they made their first canoe. I believe it was 13 feet long the first time, just for them. They got together and they're like, let's make a canoe back in 1905. And then just paddle around a local quarry and then sometimes some lakes. When the family moved, not too long after that, to the Tacoma area, they sort of set up shop here. And what I love about the Willits story is that they are unparalleled in their focus. These were two brothers who didn't really get along with each other, had very polarizing personalities, but they were united from their youth till their dying day in the singular task of making the perfect canoe. They dabbled. They made a random spattering of boats. They made a few different canoes, but really over the entirety of their lives, they were focused on the single dedication of making the perfect 17-foot canoe. And you could make the argument that they were superlative. They were successful in every way at that. And looking at these bad boys, they're absolutely gorgeous. From 1905 until their death in the 1960s, they only made canoes. And I think the only exception to that is the brief period during World War I where both brothers went overseas and served. And as they stated in their 1935 catalog, these canoes were built, quote, for utility and service. Our canoes are decidedly superior to the canvas-covered canoes. Full stop. And here's another look. So there's a huge collection. I mean, not 950, but there's a large portion of these Willits handcrafted canoes inside the Foss Waterway Seaport today. And that's a big portion of what we're going to be looking at. And here's another one for you with a little different angle on there. And what you're looking at are 7,000 copper tacks nailed into red cedar along this hull. It has brass fixtures with a little bit of spruce in there. And then each time they finished one, they put their little seal of approval, their brass nameplate right at the bow of these. Now, here's a big part of this whole thing, is that they only sold one thing. They had one standard size, one standard price. I believe this is from their 1930 catalog that they were promoting out. And there were things that you could do to customize your canoe, which we'll talk a little bit about later, like the sail kit, or you could put different add-ons here and there. But what they made was a 17-foot red cedar canoe. It was double hulled. So they essentially made it so that there was this stripped red cedar planking on the exterior. Then they would put a waterproof canvas muslin layer inside of that, and then sandwich it with another layer of that striped red cedar in there. And the way that they would do it is that some of the strips would run fore and aft from the bow to the stern. And then on the interior, they would actually run a beam of that. And I actually have got a clip so that you can see inside here what those actually look like. Literally every shot of a Willits canoe feels like it should have cello underneath it. So take a look inside this one here. So yeah, you can see those cedar planks running fore and aft on the exterior, and then they run a beam on the inside there. And then yeah, 7,000 handmade copper tacks, all placed by hand inside this vessel. And Earl and Floyd had different parts. Earl would make the pieces of the canoe, get general assembly done, and then Floyd was responsible for the masterpiece of actually assembling these vessels together. And like I said, they couldn't stand each other, so they actually worked on two different floors of their factory. The bottom floor was for Earl, the upper floor was for Floyd, and the only time that they really had interaction with each other was when the canoe's first portion was done and it got handed off to the second brother. And bear in mind, they did this for like 50 plus years, 6 days a week, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. in the same facility, just not interacting with each other, but in their complete opposites, unified to the creation of absolute perfection. Whew. If I haven't sold you on these canoes yet, just you buckle up. And yeah, so Doris Willits is someone we're going to talk about a little bit here. And then yeah, Day Island. So in case you don't have any idea what we're talking about here, let me walk you through a little bit here. So big things before we get into it. Copper and brass fasteners. This was huge because they wanted their canoes to be used on both saltwater and freshwater. And so they used these copper fasteners and then spar varnish on the red cedar there to make them both seaworthy and freshwater vessels. And then they all had the little Willits emblem up there. And when properly maintained, they can last ages. Only a couple of them have pretty significant wear on them, like this one, which is at the seaport today. And even this is still a waterproof worthy vessel, but it just has a little bit less sheen than a few of them. Their factory started officially in, I believe, 1914 is when they get their first business license. Prior to that, they were still making canoes, but I'm trying to remember what they were listed at. I think it was like Earl was a machinist, Floyd was a carpenter. And Earl worked briefly as a draftsman for the Northern Pacific Railway, and Floyd was a painter for the city for a period there, like early 1900s, probably 1911 or 1912. And then when they decide to go into business full time together, it's 1914. And that's the first time that you can see them listed with their business license as canoe maker. And they have a small little factory out by Wallachet first. And as business starts to expand and they need some more space, they get their location in 1914 on Day Island, which is the one that you're looking at right here. Day Island is just to the west of the Tacoma area for my people who aren't locals, or for those who are locals but haven't gotten out to this area here. You may know it where Narrows Brewing is. Just a little bit south of that, Day Island is. And it's really just this lonely, tiny little residential spit of land out there. I've got a satellite view so that you can see. You go across the Day Island Bridge there onto the island, and then you can see the factory basically right in the middle there, just west of where it says Day on Day Island Boulevard. That's the factory. And here's another view of it. It's still that white building kind of right in the center there. This is what it looks like today. And this is the factory that they were using up through the 1960s. While it no longer has that, let's see here, this very vintage, old time feel to it. They did some modernizing to it, but they worked in it till the very last day. What ends up happening is the two brothers are canoe makers for their entire life. Floyd passes first, I believe in 1967. And after his brother dies, Earl locks up the shop, leaves everything just as it was. And that was the end of the Willits canoe production line. The legacy is what exists beyond that. And if you have the opportunity, occasionally they let people take a look inside. It's astounding. The tools and the materials are all still on the wall right there. And you get to see a little glimpse into what made these so miraculous, because the majority of these Willits Brothers canoes are identical. The only thing that separates them are little pieces of detail work. So Earl and Floyd both focused on doing, with just military precision, their job. And the pieces that Earl would create would then get passed on up to Floyd, and he would assemble them perfectly into these canoes. And so as you can see here, these are really identical in a lot of ways. It's just little things that change them up. And the addition of the sail kit is what makes these ones pretty remarkable. But in the factory right now, it's exactly where they left it. And I love it because you get a little sneak peek at their process here. You can see how the exterior part of that had already been formed, and now they're working on molding those interior pieces of red cedar. They're wrapping them around the mold and then getting them ready to be installed in there. And I'm glad you asked, Carol. If you'd love to look inside, we actually have some video footage so that you can actually take a look inside the factory here really quick. It is dated. I'm just going to prep you for that right now, but I want you to get a look inside it because it's just a core sample of history. It's this little slice of time. And so if I can pull it up really quick, you get to actually look inside the factory.
My uncle's just exactly the same. Up here are all pieces. They're all been matched up. You can see they're all bundled up. That's the outside planking. All the parts are made in jigs. So they could take a piece of cedar, go through it, make a piece of cedar for one of these inside things. And they're exactly the same from when they started building the canoe until they quit finishing building the canoe. Here are all the seats. They've been built up to the last coat of varnish. There's the tacks.
Wondering how this is joined. Is it
It's done with dowel.
Doweled.
It's got dowels.
Sure, sure.
In fact, you can see the dowel that holds it here.
Mm-hmm.
It had to be 22 feet minimum without any knots. So it's clear, ladder grade cedar. So it's tight cedar.
Right.
So it's real and it's vertical grain cedar.
Sure.
These are paddles.
Oh, wow.
Again, that's spruce. The 25 paddles. Here, all the things that they need to assemble the canoe. They have everything in it. They were all most of them are all labeled, but some of the labels have fallen out. My job was to run the nail machine over here. It's what it would do is set the nails. One strip would go down. There's a hole in the end of the building, so you'd have the strips that would go lengthwise. You put it in, and you'd work the nail machine like this, and it would Just punch a hole, pull the piece down, punch a little hole, and stick the nail in. And then you run the strip all the way through. That's why all the nails are the same distance apart.
Oh, jeez.
And then you take and turn it over, and you start it and run it back through again. So you have nails on both sides of the strip. As soon as I finished that, my uncle would grab it, throw it on, and start nailing it to go on.
And waterproof glue was available in 19...
Yeah, it was actually it's like a tar. It's black. And that was one of their problems that they had. That tar type glue would never set up. So it always migrated a little bit. If you look into some of the older canoes, you'll see a black line inside, also a black line on the outside.
Okay.
More on the inside than the outside. And that's where the glue would migrate through. And Earl came up here. He fixed the parts.
So a couple things that got brought up here, which I think I'd love to address. The migratory nature of that marine tar. And to achieve this water repellent glue that would bind, you had to use this special tar mixture that they came up with, but it would move around if you didn't set it right. And I believe the Willits solution was to sandwich it between those two layers of red cedar and then to add the additional layer of that waterproof canvas. Because prior to the Willits design, the majority of canoes that were made in the United States were, a wood interior with a canvas exterior. They would stretch canvas on the exterior of a canoe and then send it out on the water, which has a myriad of dangers that come with it. Most decidedly, canoe canvas rips very easily. So, you're coming up to shore, you hit a sharp rock, a stick, something like that, you start to destroy your canoe really rapidly. The addition of that red cedar made it remarkably strong, but also kept it very light. Also, fun fact, when red cedar reaches a certain age in its life, I think it's just over 100 years, it starts to become naturally waterproof. So not only are the Willits canoes impossible to replicate because they've never been able to find someone with that same dedicated precision, I'm going to call it a calling, really. These guys were drawn to this craft inescapably. No one's had that same drive to create by hand a Willits canoe, but also finding cedar like that is now impossible because trees that age are protected. And we had a great question here. Did they have to get permission from the city to go and take down these trees? No. In fact, the majority of their timber came from people that they knew. People would be like, I want to get this cedar out of my yard or whatever. And so they would go fell the tree themselves, mill that timber, and then use it to create their canoes, which, it's absolutely astounding. And they were in every sense of the word artists. They were driven by this passion to create something perfect. And each one was just another step in the right direction towards creating their, I don't even know what you call it, their finest work of art. So all of those tools, all of it is captured, frozen in time inside their factory there on Day Island to this day. And you can still see inside there. The final steps that they would do after completing the canoe itself was they would add decks, keel, and then they would add those brass portions on the bow and the stern. Then they would do seats and then the outside stems. Once they would clean everything down, sand it down, they would add that spar varnish on the exterior there. And I believe they did 4 coats, if I'm not mistaken. They used badger hair brushes. And they had a special portion of the factory where they would do varnish exclusively because they didn't want to run the risk of any sawdust or contaminants being in the air and then getting in there to disturb that. So it has this beautiful clear coat on there. I'll give you a look at when you're up close to them, they almost glow. They just radiate a life of their own. And there's something about a hand-built wooden boat or canoe or ship that has a life and a character all its own. And while they're all identical, you can almost see, I think, the personality in each one of these. We actually got to talk briefly with Jeff Nordstrom. He runs the dock down at the Foss Waterway Seaport, and he is a huge advocate and fan for the Willits canoes down here. And I'll let you hear from him very briefly, kind of what he loves about these.
Okay, Jeff Nordstrom, Foss Waterway Seaport. I maintain our facilities and all our dock space, our 1,207 linear feet of dock on the water. We have an example of one of the few rare Willits sail canoes that they built. And the fact that it's definitely been used, I like the way it looks. And people weren't afraid to take it out there in the water and have fun with it at that point. So I just think it's one of my favorite artifacts in the building, definitely. The fact that it's a Willits and all the hand labor that went into building each one of the canoes, and then the fact that they thought, you know, a sail being added would make it an additional way to propel the canoe in addition to paddling. So I think it was a well thought out design on their part.
Now, not only are they brilliantly designed as far as durability, overall beauty, and waterproof specifications, but the rudder system was pretty revolutionary as well. For the sail ones, they could add these brass and spruce rudders at the back, which were controlled by these two essentially poles there, so that you could steer while you were sailing out there, and it all affixed through these brass fixtures that they machined themselves. When you're looking at that up close detail on there, it's just jaw-dropping. But they had sort of a slow uptake on the whole thing, right? When you're looking at the Willits history, there's a lot of photos of, so this is Garrison Boathouse on American Lake. These are all Willits Brothers canoes, which were rented out there. But it wasn't until the 1930s, really, that the canoe really took on. If you're curious if there are any Willits rentals still out there, there are. Gig Harbor Boat Shop in, you guessed it, Gig Harbor, actually still has a original, genuine Willits Brother canoe, which you can rent. It's only $15 if you don't have a membership. It's only available on Saturdays. But I have a brief little video here too. You can see this beauty coming out through the mist around the Narrows here. And for me, it's like poetry. But also how lively they are. They cut through the water. They really jam, and they have a responsiveness and a springiness that's pretty amazing. One of the things that I encountered while I was looking up kind of the popularity of canoeing was that it really sort of to catch its stride in the 1930s, and a big portion of that is responsible thanks to the Willits. So in 1933, a woman, her husband, and their tiny little puppy took a journey from Tacoma up to Alaska in a Willits canoe. Documented the entire thing, Tacoma to Juneau, and National Geographic ran the article on it. And people went bananas for it. The Jack Kerouac adventure story of it was instantly enticing to everyone, and there was a sudden increase in desire for a Willits canoe. Understandably, because you look at this picture, especially in 1933, people are like, whoa, that's a good looking canoe. Also, Bob and Louise Lind, pictured here, shaking hands with Mayor Kaufman here in Tacoma in 1939, took a trip from, I believe, Fort Benton, Montana to New Orleans through the Missouri and Mississippi River, and then came back and were celebrated as heroes. So again, 1933, Nat Geo runs an article about canoeing from Tacoma up to Alaska. Then Tacoma natives, Bob and Louise here, go down the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers. And suddenly there's this huge like heroism about the canoe journeys through America. And I've been told, though I haven't been able to confirm it, that Henry and Abigail Foss of the Thea Foss legacy there also retraced the journeys of Lewis and Clark in a Willits canoe. And the Foss kids here, although pictured in their old age in this picture, were neighbors on Day Island with the Willits brothers. So they were one of the few to actually get in and get a Willits canoe early on, because here's the thing about making your canoes by hand. It was a slow process, and they only made a certain number each year. There's a fabled wait list where if you wanted one of these Willits brothers canoes, you had to jump on the wait list and just see when it was going to happen. And the legend is that if they didn't like you, like they knew you and they weren't a fan of who you were, you might stay at the bottom of the wait list forever, like miraculously somehow never move your way up. And if I'm not mistaken, the wait list is still inside the factory today, so that you can see the roster of people who are waiting for the canoes that will now never arrive. Let's see if I can switch you guys to the next one here, because it was the Willits brothers that I think were responsible for a lot of national fame for canoeing as sort of an American pastime in a lot of ways. They were responsible for bringing this type of canoe to the area. The only canoes that were here beforehand were, of course, for the Puyallup, the Nisqually, the Stillicum, and they were these dugout cedar canoes. It wasn't seen as a recreational tool very much until the Willits started popularizing this hand-built, double-layered red cedar canoe in the area there. And when they did, you start seeing more and more stories show up. So this is Edwin Spinden out of Galveston, Texas, who took a trip from Chicago down to Texas. It was 2,000 miles in this canoe pictured right here. Not a Willits, but is part of this like national fame of canoeing entering the mainstream. You can also see in 1951, the hit classic, it's here on the picture, thankfully. The Whip Hand, which if you haven't seen, I've actually watched this movie, is essentially about a magazine writer on vacation with his lady, and they find out that Nazis are using experimentation to kill fish in this lake, trying to hatch a dangerous ploy, and they save the day. It's pretty great, honestly. And then in the 1960s, this particular movie here, which is about a sociology professor who's doing like experiments to see people's proclivities about sex and whatnot. I've not actually seen this one, but I've heard a great deal about it. This was another sort of like, oh, canoeing can be sexy moments to the American mainstream here. And you start to see more and more canoes becoming like the thing that people do going out recreationally. Giving you a brief glimpse at how popular canoeing was in the 1930s, we actually have a clip for you now of canoe tricks. And I would apologize for how dated this is, but I absolutely will not, because it is delicious.
No doubt about it that the canoes have a big advantage over the motors as to the right of way. Well, that's some getaway. I wonder if the old man can stage a comeback. Certainly looks like it. And sure enough, the flip, the world's record is 1 4/5 seconds. The double flip. And the slow motion of the flip. Notice the hollow in the water under the canoe. And the action of the feet when getting in.
Just a quick taste of that for you guys. Also, a brief glimpse at my future. I hope to be narrating black and white canoe films as I age out of the tour business someday. But enough about that. What I love about seeing the Willits today is getting those little slices of history. And this is a really good one for that because it still has the camp logo on it. There was a camp just off the coast of Fox Island, which, if you're not familiar, is sort of sandwiched in between the peninsula and Tacoma proper. And right in the hollow of Fox Island is a little tiny, tiny island where Tahagawa Camp used to be located. It was a boys' summer camp. And the island is actually fascinating. It used to be called Grave Island, colloquially. It was an area where the Nisqually were still doing canoe burials, essentially, where when a member of the tribe would die, they would lay them in a canoe and then loft it up into a tree. And this was a sacred burial site for a very long period of time there. In the days where it was a summer camp, it was exclusively populated by Willits canoes. That's what they would learn to cruise around on. And then they would use them for rentals for island residents in the time when it wasn't a summer camp. And when you look at the rise of canoeing as a popular sport in the area, it pretty much parallels, in my mind, the popularity of the Willits canoe in the area. What baffles me to this day, though, is their pricing, right? So they're not making a ton of these canoes. They're not mass producing them. They do them by hand. They only create a specific number each year, and they don't do it in the summer. Spring, fall, and winter are their production times. And this is their price sheet from 1928. A 17-foot canoe is $100. And sure, there are some add-ons here and there, but living on that, even in the 1920s, seems particularly lean to me. And I've never been able to crunch the numbers to figure out what it is that they were doing right and wrong, I guess. The promotion on it was fantastic. They had huge celebrity endorsements, including Paul Lipsky here, the undefeated national champion paddler for the United States. And they were instrumental in sort of telling the narrative of canoeing in the area. And they had sort of really cool inventions that went along with their canoes, including the copper air tanks, which you don't see a lot of. But for, I believe, $10 extra, they would add at the fore and the stern a copper air tank for increased buoyancy there. And that was one of the many sort of cool add-ons that they could kind of upsell you with on their canoes. But they were dedicated. This wasn't something they were doing for the money. It was something they were doing because, as far as I can tell, they were obsessed with perfecting the craft of the perfect canoe. And you can see a couple of them here, both with sails and without. This is all from their 1920s catalog, which is still online if you guys ever want to see the PDF of it. They were responsible for every piece of this. Not only the canoes, but Earl was the photographer that would go out and take these pictures, and then he and Floyd would together assemble these catalogs. They wrote the copy. They were responsible for the marketing. They were involved every step of the way, beginning to end, on this entire process. To give you a little more in-depth look at that, we actually have some really great clips here with Lon and Kendall Willits. Lon was the nephew I guess still is, the nephew of Earl and Floyd Willets, and Kendall is his son, and they have some great stuff to say, and I want to share that with you.
And here's some pictures of inside the factory. All kinds of articles in here.
Oh, wow.
It's Lon Willits. He's the nephew of the Earl and Floyd Willets. I'm Kendall Willits. I'm Lon Willits' son, and related to the Willits brothers.
In the early 30s and 40s and 20s, my uncles would build a canoe right. The wood would come from local people. We'd go to somebody's house and down a tree, and it was just the two brothers. And they worked by themselves, but they worked 7 to 7 every single night, 6 days a week. The way they put the canoe together was completely different than most of the canoes that were of that day. Most of the canoes of that day were covered on the outside with canvas and wood on the inside. They were the first canoe that had both wood on the outside and wood on the inside. The canoe factory is laid out as more for Floyd than it is for Earl. Earl was really good at making parts. He would do the inside, the outside, the top paddles. He would do everything, but it was done perfectly. Where upstairs, Floyd wouldn't, he would kind of put things together. If it didn't fit exactly right, he would make them fit. But the only building during the winter time. The summertime was mainly used for the canoeing and promotion, things like that. But their marketing strategy when I worked for them was nothing. Some of them went to Europe, and some went to China. Wow. Some went to all over the world. My uncles would sell canoes.
Basically, after Earl finished the last canoe, the door was locked, and that was it. So until I went in there and repaired them, but still there was stuff that was locked up, and it was still that at one time I thought, maybe the canoe business is for me, and then I decided that maybe it's not, and it's a legacy that I wish I could continue, but it never happened. But we still have the Willits canoe in the blood, and we're still we're still amazed as we go in and we see a canoe. We go, oh my God! You have to go touch it, and just beautiful. So
there's tons of stories
Right.
with my uncles, because they're two different people completely, and they started out very young in life when they turned high school, and they made lots of canoes, and they started in Washoe Bay, and when there was concrete over there, and they made the mold out of wood here on the island. My grandfather is one who built the canoe factory, and so it's been in the family for a long time.
we would like to see the public of today and the future see what happened in Tacoma, what these two brothers did, to change kind of the boating history in the Northwest with canoes, because there wasn't really any canoes in the Northwest except for dugout cedar canoes. So they kind of changed the history, and then changed basically our history with my dad building ski boats to, we'd love to see it. People know what it is, because a lot of people nowadays with the younger generation, they don't respect or understand wooden boats and the craftsmanship that goes into it. To see a canoe and see how someone handmade that canoe, and especially with the Willits brothers, to see that two guys did this, you know, and the controversy that they had of not being able to get along and be able to build something that was perfection. For years, people have been trying to get a hold of us and calling my grandmother, because my grandmother lived next to the factory, and you're probably hitting us at a really good time. It's a really good part of history of right now to talk about this, because we've been thinking about it. So we're very happy to work with the Seaport at this time.
So that's an important point that he brings up, is that the Willits legacy goes beyond just the canoes. The Willits family, members of it, now create boats themselves, but not the canoes that the Willits brothers focused on so heavily for their entire lives. There are ski boats, which, here's my moment to give props to the Pacific Northwest. If you saw our virtual tour on rum running and smuggling, it was a rum runner here in the Puget Sound who first had the idea that you could take old plane engines and then install them inside lightweight, low-profile craft so that you could outpace not only other rum runners, but the Coast Guard and Customs. And so the modern jet boat, as we know it today, really found its birth here in the waters of Puget Sound. Sure, for smuggling Canadian whiskey, whatever. It's a necessity of invention. But the Willits sort of Venn diagram of smuggling jet boats and then beautifully handcrafted wooden boats kind of comes together in the new Willits legacy here. The Willits brothers themselves did create more than canoes for a period of time here. This is the Willits launch. Whew. I lost you guys there for a second. Hopefully you're still there. Hold on one second. I'm going to bring my thing back up here. Here's the joy of doing virtual, right? All right, so here's the Willits launch. I'm going to take you so that you can actually see it here really quick. But they designed this not through any great passion, but they needed a way to start transporting those red cedar logs to their facility on Day Island. And so what they did was they just made their own boat. It was completely unique. There was nothing really like this at the time, but they're like, hey, we can build something like this. And thus they did, taking them from just exclusively manufacturers of canoes into the maritime boat building trade as a whole. And this was really just for them. It was designed to transport groceries, to get people moved around here or there, or with the primary intention of towing red cedar logs back to the facility on Day Island, where they could then turn them into canoes. And that's on display at the Seaport Museum today. You can go down and see the Willits launch. And while it's not in the immaculate condition that a lot of these canoes are, it's because it was used so much more. When you're down there, you'll get to see a lot of other artifacts as well. They've got a few of the original Willits catalogs down there. A little bit about the people that have donated the canoes that are now on display there, because a few of them are just on loan and have found their way to the Seaport over time because people wanted to keep that story and that legacy alive. And when you look at them, you can't blame them. These canoes are absolutely stunning. And each one of them, I think, straddles the line between uniformity and something unique. While they are impossibly similar, I think, for something that was handcrafted by two guys who weren't even working together really in the same room. You know, they were separate and didn't talk to each other very much at all. To have these two conflicting sources come together and then just in the final hour put something together that is so individualized but so uniform is absolutely stunning to me. Like I said, it was 1962 that Floyd passed away. He had already lost his wife, Ruth, several years earlier to a heart attack, I believe. And that was the end of the Willits canoe making tradition. Earl at that point stopped what he was doing, finished that shift, locked up the shop, and then it's there exactly as it was. And it was only a few years or a couple of years after that that Earl passed away as well. And thus the end really came. While the Willits canoe facility is still in the hands of the Willits family, it is just that perfect time capsule. It's a snapshot from history, left exactly the way that everything was, down to the waiting lists, the tools that were on the bench, the projects that were midway done. With the end of the brothers came the end of the Willits canoe enterprise. And for me, I think that's the testament to how remarkably driven these two men were in this task. It was never, I think, designed to be the business that like maintained something. It wasn't supposed to be like an empire or a legacy that was passed down. It was just something that I feel like was in them. It was a call that they couldn't escape. But through that passion and through that pursuit of perfection, they created something that has echoed for generations. The Willits canoes remain one of the treasured pieces of the history of this area here and have become globally famous. I think Lon was the one who was saying that, you know, they've been shipped abroad. Some have been requested by people in Europe, China, beyond. This is a canoe that was recognized for its perfection, its durability, and its usefulness. And they were used, is what I love so much. They were never just designed to be works of art that were hung up on the wall. These were designed to be taken out in the water and enjoyed. And so the fact that the Gig Harbor Boat Shop still has one that can be rented by people in the area, that's really remarkable to me as well, because it's an opportunity for you to actually get out there and experience one of these craft the way that it was meant to be experienced. If you'd like to see one and not pilot it, but get a sort of a closer look at a larger collection of those, the Seaport is actually in the process of revamping their Willits experience right now as well. So the Foss Waterway Seaport, right down there on the Foss Waterway, is your opportunity to get to go see them. And I'm telling you, there's just like this glow. There's like a shimmer on each of them, and it's like meeting a person. You get close to one of these canoes and you're like, wow, there's a story here. You've lived a life, my friend. I want to go get a beer with this canoe. That said, if you've enjoyed your tour tonight and you'd like to buy your guide a beer, you can always do so. There's a PayPal link on the homepage of Pretty Gritty Tours. Not necessary, but if you want to show your appreciation, you always can. With that, my friends, I'm going to let you embark on the metaphorical canoe of knowledge. Go forth into the world and enjoy your experiences. I will see you very soon. We have a series of very cool tours coming up for the fall with some really cool exclusive footage of places you normally wouldn't be able to get into, some haunted stuff. And then our next one with the Foss Waterway Seaport is one I'm, guess what, very excited for. It is the tour of the Port of Tacoma. We get a lot of inside footage of that, as well as the history of the largest port in Washington State. So keep your eyes peeled, my friends. Until next time, keep on exploring. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. And on behalf of the Foss Waterway Seaport and Columbia Bank, thank you and good night.